Okay, welcome everybody. Hello to today's webinar. Our topic for today is testing, processes in the context of Camunda. A few organizational things before we start. The first thing is we will have a recording for that webinar, so afterwards you will get a link to a video where you can watch everything again or can share that to colleagues or anything. So we will get that to you afterwards. If you experience any audio problems, I hope not, but if it's so, the best is to dial in. I put the number in chat window so that you can find some information how to log in with your phone. If you have any questions, we will have a Q&A session at the end of that webinar. So we will have like 55 minutes webinar from now on, and then we have like 5 to 10 minutes Q&A. And if you have any questions, just type them in the chat window immediately, and I will collect them at the end and answer them in one compact session. Okay, basically that's it. So let's get started. Wait a second. So you should be able to see my screen now. Okay, so who am I? Maybe first things first. My name is Bernd Rücker. I'm one of the two founders of Camunda, and I'm basically working with workflow and processes in the Java area for basically all my life. And I'm personally have a Java EE background, so I'm software developer kind of. And currently I'm working as an evangelist, so I'm basically touring around a lot, showing Camunda to different people. And I'm still doing a lot of assignments at customers, especially proof of concept. So what I still want to see is out there, how the platform is used, what problems the people are solving with it, and yeah, basically just your experiences out there. So I'm still on the road a lot. If you have any questions for me, send me an email. You have my email address here. You can find me on Twitter. I'm pretty sure you will find a channel to ask me some questions. Let's quickly jump into the topic. So today we want to talk about testing. And obviously, I don't want to motivate that today. Software has to be tested. And as we have BPMN processes executable, they are some kind of software, right? So they are some kind of source code. So that must be tested as well. And there are a couple of special challenges when you test processes. I think the biggest is if you have a BPMN process, you do a lot of service orchestration. So you call other services like whatever an SAP system, a Siebel system, Salesforce, whatever it is. And that means that the overall process, if you want to test that, it's a kind of integration test. And you have to think about mocking and all these kind of things. So that makes it much more complex than testing a small, like a Java algorithm or something like that. And I have an example on that later on as well. They should normally be more business driven. So because yeah, we have the transparency with the BPMN process. That's all about communication between business and IT. So test cases are normally motivated by the business as well. I have an example on that later on. Keep in mind that there are different tests, like functional tests, if the software is working, if the process is doing the right things in the right way. And there are other things like performance and load tests. So we'll mention that later on as well. Just to give you some groundwork here, I don't want to introduce the whole Camunda BPM platform in this webinar because that would consume too much time. But as a reminder, we have that embeddable engine. So the core engine is a small jar, and you can run that in every environment. And you can start up the engine very easy with one line of code with an in-memory, for example, in-memory H2 database. And that's actually something we can leverage for testing. Because it's really easy. There's no container we need. There's no other environment things we need. So we can just start up an engine very, very easy. And we will do that in test cases in a minute. We have the option to run the engine as service of the container. We call that shared engine. So the engine is already started as part of your, for example, Tomcat or JBoss or WebSphere or whatever it is. And then you just deploy what we call process applications, normal board deployments containing a BPMN file. And If you run that environment, it might be interesting to look at a different kind of test cases. And we have that remote process engine model as well. What is, let's say, the typical way for the for a lot of BPM suites out there? We just have a remote engine talking to that via web services. Don't want to look into that into too much details today, because for testing, it's much more interesting to concentrate on the others. But we will have 1 or 2 remarks on that model as well. Okay, just as a reminder, if you look at testing now, what we normally do at customer projects, we define 3 scopes for testing. Just go briefly over them, and then we look into them in more depth afterwards. So the first scope is basically a very, very limited scope, where we say we have the process. We want to test the process model. With the process model, I mean basically the BPMN XML file. Then we have on the gateways, for example, some expression logic, expression language. This is something we want to test. We want to somehow test the service task. With the service task, we connect Java code, right? So we have Java delegates connected to the service task, or we might have listeners connected to some other points in the process. This is something we want to test as well. I come back to that in a minute why. And that's basically it, okay? So we don't want to have any environmental issues here. It should be a simple unit test. It should be in memory, so with an in-memory database. I don't need any database on the system. It should be a single thread, so no threading issues, multi-threading issues here. We don't want to have a container, because that's too much overhead to run for a simple unit test, and we don't need a job executor, because we are single-threaded. Okay, so that's the most inner scope. We will look into that into more depth in like 2 or 3 minutes. If we go one step bigger, and that's something we will tackle later in the webinar, it might be that you have some, for example, JPA entities, or you have some transactional issues, or dependency injection, or whatever it is. So it might be that you want to test these things in combination with your process. That means the scope is a bit bigger, because now we need container services like CDI or JPA or these kind of things. And yeah, it's possible by either using a container, or maybe you're using Spring, then you can run something here, or other frameworks. We will come back to that in a minute. And the biggest scope, our test scope 3, is that we really run the whole system like on an integration environment, really a real server. You're talking to real systems, like maybe test systems with test data. You're using the UI, the user interface, these kind of things. So that's really an end-to-end test here. And we made pretty good experiences actually with these 3 test scopes. And I come back to that in the recap at the end, what might make sense for you and what not. Because the interesting thing is to basically define which test scopes you want to run your tests in, and what you want to tackle in your tests. But let's jump to an example that we get our hands dirty. So this is a very simple BPMN process. It starts, and we have user task, we have a timer, then we have a decision, and we have service task. If you want to test that on our test scope 1, we have a couple of things to clarify. The first thing, which is always interesting, and this is why I added it to the example, is the timer. Obviously, we don't want to wait 2 hours in our unit test for the timer to be due. So what we do here is we execute the timer directly via API immediately. And that's what I mentioned earlier, that because we are doing that via API ourselves in the unit test, it's not necessary that the job executor component of our platform runs in order to check timers, because that's normally done in the background by this job executor constantly checking for new jobs. And that's a new thread or a complete thread pool. And that's something we don't want to have in that scope. And we don't need it because we execute everything ourselves. And then we have the service task, where we obviously have to use some mock. Okay, come back to that in a minute. The interesting question here is always what to mock. I have this discussion very often, actually. So if we look at the service task, what we normally have for a service task, we attach code, we attach Java code. For example, we have that customer service adapter calling some customer service. It might be whatever, a Salesforce, web service, or whatever it is. Doesn't matter at this moment. But it's the real service. But what this Java code normally has, the adapter, is we have an input mapping. So we're basically reading data from the process context, from the variables. We're calling the service. And then if we get some data back, we're somehow processing it. So we're doing an output mapping. And that's actually what these delegates or these adapters should do. Okay. And that means what I don't want to do is to mock the whole adapter. Because if I mock the whole adapter, if I don't call that code at all, I'm basically testing that the process runs through the BPMN file. So I'm basically testing if the engine can execute BPMN 2.0, which is something you don't have to test. That's something we test already, right? So for me, it's always important that you run through the delegates, because they are doing all the input and output mapping, and that's something for the data flow which you have to test. Okay, so what I want to mock actually is the real service call. Okay, and just that service call. We will see how you can do that in a minute in the demo. Okay, so that's the setup, and I directly want to jump into the demo. So what I have here, it's a simple project containing the process. Whole code is online. GitHub, I sent the link later in the chat, so you can have a look at all the details later on yourself, and you can run it yourself. And the first thing we have a look at is the process test case here. So we are using normal JUnit tests. In case you're using TestNG, it's possible as well, but we have a really good integration into JUnit, especially a JUnit so-called rule, which basically means it's included in the life cycle of the test case. So what this rule does, it basically in the background starts a process engine, a Camunda process engine, from a configuration which is found in the test resources, and it's named Camunda CFG XML. So that's a configuration which is used here, which is basically using a standalone in-memory process engine configuration. Okay. I don't want to go into too much details here. But you can see that's a simple H2 in-memory database. Very easy. Okay. Good. So then the engine is started. Then we have a normal test case. We have the add deployment annotation, which basically means this process is deployed for the test case, and afterwards it's undeployed again. So that basically means I'm always having a clean and empty engine, which is pretty nice. So I don't have to care about some garbage in the engine from other test runs or whatever. We normally, as a good hint, always have an empty method just deploying the process, which fails if there's anything in the BPMN file which is not deployable. So it might be that you forgot some attributes which are mandatory or whatever. So then this test case already fails. And then we normally have one test case per scenario. So basically we define scenarios running through the process model. In our case, we have the test for B and for C, right? So the two paths here. Okay, so then what we do is something which is really cool actually, which is called Camunda BPM assert. It's an additional dependency we have here. And then what I get is a couple of helpers, like just accessing the process engine easier in order to start a new process instance. But what you get with Camunda BPM assert is this assertion API. You might know that from JUnit, I guess so. So what I can always do is I can assert that this process instance now is started, is waiting at this precise user task. There is a task created in our task management, which is assigned to the group management. Okay, so this is one assertion which is pretty compact, pretty readable, and it checks if that's actually true. So if the process is not in user task A, this will fail. Okay, One important remark here, what I would recommend you to is if you have these tasks, use some naming convention for the ID, because the ID, even if you cannot see it on the model, so it's during runtime, it doesn't make a big or it doesn't have a big visible impact. It's very important to keep your user tests, your test cases readable. Okay, and this will end up in a couple of database tables as well. So it makes sense anyway to have a good naming convention for the IDs. Okay, so this is that. So the process is started. Then this is something the assertion API provides as well. So Camunda BPM assert. I have a shortcut API, so I can complete the current task. The current task basically corresponds to the current process instance I asserted. Since I'm single-threaded, it's not a problem to guess the right task here at this moment. And as you can see, it gets very compact, very readable, right? I assert that the task is there, then I complete it, and I hand over some variables. This variable is used in order to steer the gateway to the one or the other path. I could do this with the Java API, right? So I could say, give me the task service, and I complete the task with that ID. I make a query to find the right task ID and this kind of things. So that's, I could do everything via the normal API, but the assertion API is really cool. We use it in basically all projects by now, right? Because it's really readable. The thing, that's what I mentioned earlier, if I have the process instance, I can assert that it's currently waiting in the timer event. So there's a job internally, timers are jobs with the date, and that's a timer event, right? So there. Okay. And then what I meant earlier, I can just execute it. Okay, I don't have to do any very special stuff, don't have to wait for 2 hours, it just executed. Then the process moves on, and then I can assert that the process has ended, and I can assert that it has passed a couple of activities, which I expect actually the path. Makes sense, right? Hopefully. Hopefully. So I can simply start this as a unit test. And what's really important for me is that this is really easy to do, right? Just a right click and run as JUnit test. So you don't need any setup. I don't need any magic environment properties. I don't need any Maven profile or whatever. Even if I'm a new developer in the project, I just check it out and can run the JUnit test. And it's actually pretty fast. Okay, that's 4 seconds. I think my machine has some problem at the moment. It should be faster actually, but the most of the time is for setting up the H2 database. So if I run a couple of tests, it shouldn't actually should be same speed, more or less. So basically the setup takes time, right? Not the test case. Okay. One little thing here, which is it's not a productized part of Camunda BPM, but it's a small example we provide in GitHub, which is actually pretty cool. So we have a small coverage tool. What it does actually, it just reads the history and writes a small report from there, an HTML report. So I just executed the test B, for example, so I can see visually which path it was in that test case. Or I maybe want to see, okay, path D, what was that? And I can see the whole coverage, which basically means which activities were executed in the whole test suite. Okay, I don't see the combination of paths, but I see if every activity was at least executed once, which is already a pretty good coverage, to be honest, for most of the projects I know. So I would not aim for have all combinations tested, because that's normally, if you have a huge process model, the complexity gets too big. And I think it's more important to have a couple of really maintained tests which are working all the time, which deliver big value, and not aim for the last 20%, which consumes a lot of effort. Okay, So this is the very unit test, right, on scope 1. I had, for example, that's an interesting thing for testing path C. There I had, okay, path B was easy because path B, there I had a delegate which just logged something on the console, so I could execute that in the test case, so I didn't care about it actually. If I go that path, I did it a bit differently. So what I attached here is a expression language. So I call a bean here, and I used in this case CDI in order to call that adapter here, where I named. So in the unit test, I don't have a CDI environment up and running, right? So what I did is that we have a mocks facility here from us where you can just, it's pretty simple actually. So you can register beans with that name, and I say, okay, please call this delegate now. So if you execute that bean, it resolves to that object here, which basically does nothing. Okay, that's a very easy thing here to do in order to run to path C. That's what I mentioned earlier, but this is not what I would recommend to do, because now you don't test the Java delegate at all. You just skip it. Okay, but it has too much logic in it. It needs to be tested in the context of the process. So what you can do in order to make that better, you can use a mock framework. Okay, we don't have an own mock framework. Doesn't make sense, right? There are a lot of mock frameworks out there. We're working very often with Mockito, and in combination with PowerMock, that's pretty powerful. JMockit is okay. There are other mock frameworks out there which work as well. Actually, it doesn't matter. I would use that one you might have already in your projects available. If you don't have any mock framework yet and you want to introduce something new and you have no idea about what to use, I would just recommend to use Mockito. We have pretty good experience with that. So this is how it looks like. The first thing which is important, you have to say to run the test case with the PowerMock runner, because it does a couple of things in the background. Here's my test case. The same thing, I create a new the delegate myself. So I create that adapter here as an object. If I do the new customer service adapter here, what it basically doesn't do is the add inject, right? Because I don't have a CDI container here. And I want to inject now the customer service myself. So I create a mock by Mockito. And now I use something from PowerMock to basically set that on this adapter. There are a couple of ways doing that. You could use PowerMock in order to basically intercept the new customer service impl, so then it gets a bit more transparent in the background. You can use this one. There are a couple of ways that depends a bit on what you do exactly. Maybe you're using Spring, then you have different options as well. So I don't want to go into too much details here now because that depends a bit on your environment. But it's actually pretty easy to use a mock. And then what you can do is, for example, in Mockito, it looks like that. Say Mockito when on that mock, this method is called with, in this case, any customer object. So I don't care about the content of the customer object, about the attributes and these kind of things. Then please return this string as a customer ID. So now I have configured my mock. I start the process instance normally, right? Just run through the process instance, which is actually pretty easy here. You can see that I assert that I have a process instance, which has a task. I complete the task, I execute the drops, and that's it. Very, very short. And then I verify that this mock service with that method was called at least exactly one time. Okay. Next thing I can test here is that I check the history for my customer ID. And then I check that this is the one I expected from the. Okay, so what I tested now is I handed over the value for name and I get back the ID, which basically tests all that logic here. Okay, and just mock out this one. And that's actually a pretty good test. So this is how it should look like in real life. Okay, that was a quick overview. Have I showed that this is working? I actually don't remember. Maybe, yeah, so that's green as well. Pretty cool. One thing which is interesting hint as well, I did something here. We have a helper in order to read logging properties, and we have logging properties normally available for the test cases, which is pretty handy in order to, for example, here I switch to the fine level. So what I get is a lot of logging here, where you can see a lot of things what the engine is doing in the background, and that might really help if you're unsure of what's happening here. If that's not enough, if you're still puzzled by what the engine is doing, another good hint is to, if you're in a test case, what you can do, you can inspect the in-memory database. Okay, the database is in memory, so you have from your test case, you have to make it available to the outside in order to look at it. But H2 make that really simple. So by doing this, you can create a small web server with an HTML application to look at the database. You could start TCP server in order to accept JDBC connections as well. So then you can use SQL or DB Visualizer or whatever you want to use. So that's actually pretty cool. And you can even do that via the Eclipse display, for example. So when you're in the unit test, when you're in debug, and you're in a breakpoint and you decide, no, I want to have a look in the database, you just execute that via display and then you start looking at it. That's actually really, really cool. So just to show you that. So when I start that, I know debugged, and I'm, oh, a second, I have a couple of, I have a lot of breakpoints actually. Let's remove them. Was one too much? I don't know. I was too fast. Sorry. Let's do that again. So I add that breakpoint. I debug. We will wait for it. So now I'm right. And then what we can do is we can point a browser to that URL. So that's the JDBC URL, don't need a password, and voila, it's the database. So I can see, for example, a historic process instance. I can see exactly the process instance I just started. Yeah, just a side remark. Okay, pretty cool. So that's a good setup with JUnit, the Camunda rule, which I showed you, the Camunda BPM assert on dependency, but you get it via Maven, very easy, and the mock provider of your choice. So that gives you everything in memory. So it's always really fast, it's clean. You don't have threading issues. It's really easy to understand what happens there. You don't need an environment. You don't need a setup. It's really, you change something, you hit the run test button, and you're done. And it runs on every developer machine, right? You don't have to set up anything. You don't have to understand something. You just right click and run, which is important to maintain the test in the long run, actually. So that's why I'm a big fan, actually, of that test scope. I think you recognize that. I said earlier that we normally use the in-memory H2 database, which is because then you don't need a database. But sometimes you have test cases where you, for example, want to test some special queries, which are maybe optimized for whatever, Oracle, or you're using PLSQL or whatever. If that's the case, you can switch to the database, actually. And I think then it makes sense, but I would do that as a last resort, and I would only do that for test cases which are really have to run the database. And for all the other test cases, what is really easy to achieve is that we run the same test case to onto different configurations of the process engine on different databases. So I linked that here. We don't have a big look at that, a deeper look at that at the moment. But we do that, for example, for our test cases for the engine. So we have the same test cases. We run them on all the databases, just using some Maven profiles and some properties we provide from the outside in order to access the different databases. And then the test case is exactly the same. You can run them in your Eclipse with an in-memory H2, but on the continuous integration server, Jenkins in our case, you can run the same test case on all the databases. And that's a pretty cool environment, because then for the developer it's easy, and on continuous integration you check all the databases. I mean, for you normally it means that you have one database, the one you use. For us it needs a couple of them. Okay. Yeah, some additional hints. I already tackled most of them. You can debug into test case, inspect the database, enable the logging if you want to see something, use the naming conventions. And something I haven't mentioned yet. If you have big processes, what we normally do is we try to test them in, I call it chunks, so basically in pieces of the process. So you don't have, maybe you have a long process. At the end, you do a lot of decisions, and then for the different scenarios, you always have to walk through 2/3 of the process in order to get to that decision. And then what we today normally do is we implement methods to navigate to a certain state in the process, which is really straightforward to do. You can use the assertion API in order to do that quickly. But it's maybe not 100% perfect, right? What you can do as well, you can write a command, which is basically internal API, to start a process instance in an arbitrary node. That's possible with the engine from the inside, but it's not exposed by a public API. So you have to know a bit about our internals. Don't want to show that in detail, actually. It's possible if you need it today. But what I would do before going down that road is to wait for the 7.3. That's our next major version. It's coming in May. And there we introduce something which we call the Process Instance Modification API. There you will have the possibility in order to basically jump a token in an existing process instance to a different state, or you can start a process instance in an arbitrary node. And then it will be public API and pretty easy for you. Okay, that will come in 7.3. And I showed you the graphical test coverage tool. The tool is maybe a big word for that, but whatever. And then, there's an interesting example. I just quickly want to show that slide. It's from a German insurance company, actually a bigger one. And what they did is they defined their test cases in an Excel sheet, so Microsoft Excel, which is basically maybe not completely maintained by business analysts or business departments, but at least understood and approved. And even some test cases are defined by them, or at least by business analysts. And then what they do, they read it, they execute it as a unit test, and afterwards they even check the test coverage. So they have an impression that the test cases are somehow sufficient in order to test that process. And that turned out to be really, really helpful and helped them a lot in order to get especially regression testing running. Okay, just have the example. Some quick hint at this point, we're currently working on a project called the Camunda BPM Workbench. You have the GitHub link here, which is not yet in a stable productized state, so it's under development, but you can easily download it, you can run it, you can play around with it, give us feedback. We're always very interested in that. And there what you can do, you can connect to a running engine that might be on a server or in a test case, it's possible. And then you can set breakpoints on the BPMN process model and step through the process easily. And you can always see the context, the process variables. You can, for example, you can try out what expression language can do, what the results of various expressions are. You can use scripting in order to change something and these kind of things. So that might be helpful for debugging test cases as well. Yeah, just as a hint. I mean, it's there. You can try it out. It's actually already pretty cool. But yeah, it's not yet in a completely productized state. Good. And there are some further, especially community extensions around the testing and testing on scope 1, which I don't show in details here today because of the limited time. I just wanted to mention them. So the first is for JBehave. JBehave is a framework for BDD, behavior-driven development. And what that does is basically to provide, let's jump in the example, human readable processes like test cases. So for example, I have this scenario where I say, given the process definition simple, that's our at deployment annotation basically, and the contract is automatically processable and the contract processing succeeds when the simple process is started, which basically then triggers a new process instance. Then the contract is loaded, so these are the assertions. The contract is processed automatically, the process is finished with an event contract processed. So basically it's kind of DSL in order to write test cases, but in a business-friendly way. It's actually pretty cool, but it's a lot of effort in order to develop the DSL. So it's always not that easy to start actually. But if you have business analysts who are really eager in order to do that or to maintain that, that might be a good idea to have a deeper look at that. Yeah, you have the link here. There are some examples on the side, so you can have a deeper look yourself later on. Another thing which might be interesting is the Mockito extension, which is actually a very, very small library, like a helper. If you're using Mockito and Camunda, there are a couple of things which this extension can make easier for you. So for example, that's always an interesting example here. What I showed you at the beginning when I mocked out the service task, I basically ignored it, right? This can be done automatically here. So I say auto mock all the service tasks. So they are basically doing nothing then. But I can do verification if the service task was called, for example, and a couple of additional things. Okay. Same thing. Don't want to go into details here, but you can have a look yourself. They're both are community extension maintained by basically by a partner from us. And they're always eager to get feedback as well, and they're using a couple of products. So I'm pretty sure it's in a good shape at the moment. There is a third thing, right, which is Needle. Needle is not that known actually as a framework. Needle is a kind of a minimalistic CDI container. So if you're using CDI but you don't want to start the whole CDI stuff, Needle might help you in order to do some CDI injections. Don't want to look into that at the moment, but you have the link, right? So that brings us to the next scope. So if we are starting to use CDI or JPA or JTA transactions or whatever, so really environmental stuff where I normally use my container like my JBoss or WebSphere, if you're doing this, then you're on scope 2. Right, because then you need more infrastructure. There are a couple of ways doing that. The first is if you're Spring-driven, that's normally not a big challenge because you're starting the stuff anyway for the production system, so you can start that yourself for the test environment as well. If you're not Spring-based, if you're Java EE, it normally means that you either run it as integration test, so you start up your server, you deploy it there, you run it via a remote API or whatever, then you're in a real container, or you start up the environment yourself, starting on Vault or Hibernate or these kind of things, which normally means that you have a different environment than your production environment, which is actually a bad thing because then different things happen, right? So there's something in between, which is really interesting to have a look at, which is called Achillean. It's a JBoss framework, source framework as well. And that's something we used a lot in projects, in Java EE-based projects, right? If you're Spring-based, and what I said earlier, it might be a bit different. But then you already solved the problem anyway, so not a big deal to talk about it. But make sure you're aware that you're on scope 2. You run more infrastructure. It's a bit more heavy. It's a bit longer, the test run and these kind of things. So I wanted to show you a quick demo with Aquilion. So what Aquilion does, that's actually really interesting. They, in your JUnit test on your Eclipse or NetBeans or whatever, you run the JUnit test, and it basically creates a deployment, a small deployment, talks to your running application server like Tomcat or JBoss or whatever, deploys it there, including the JUnit test, and run the JUnit test in the context of the server. And if that's finished, it gets undeployed, and I show the result in JUnit on your Eclipse, on your client. So you're really running in a real server environment, and it's just cool. I mean, I can show you that. So we're still in debug here. Don't need that part anymore. Okay. So how does that look like? I have an Aquilion test. So I run it with Aquilion. I create the deployment here. That's maybe a trick. So that's not our deployment, it's the Aquilion deployment, where you basically create a war file where you can select what you include in the war. You add all your main dependencies, you have the processes for us. You might have Java classes, the process file for these kind of things. So that's your deployment, right? Now let's have a look what we want to check here, what we actually want to test, because now on scope 2 I want to actually test that service, because that service is not what I said earlier, Salesforce or something. It's an own service. It might be an EJB. It's not yet an EJB, but it could be easily an EJB. Well, it's an EJB, and where I inject an entity manager in order to store a JPA entity. So my customer, which I hand in here, it's a JPA entity. Okay. So this is something we want to do here. And I really want to call that service now. So I need the persistence context. I need Hibernate, right? I that on my in the background. I have a JBoss running. Yeah. Okay. And Aquilion basically connects that. What I can do now in my JUnit test is I can do add inject process engine, which is already pretty cool because my unit test is now in a CDI environment. I can get the entity manager. I can start process instances. This time I don't do any mocking, right? Because I'm in the scope 2. I want to call my EJB and my JPA entity. I do most of my assertions, and at the end I check the customer ID again, and then what I can do is I ask the entity manager to find the customer for me and check that it was persisted and that it got the right content. So what happens now if I run that, I just do right click, run a unit test. It takes a moment because it now connects to my JBoss in the background. You can actually configure what it should do there, connecting to a running JBoss, starting a known JBoss, and these kind of things. Now you can see it's deploying, right? It's running the test case within the JBoss, and I get the result back that the test case was successful. Okay, that's really cool. If you wanna test on this scope. Something we did in a recent project, and we do in our own QA as well. Not if you know Docker, it's actually pretty famous at the moment. So it's kind of a virtual machine, but on a higher level. So they're sharing a couple of resources, different Docker. They're called containers. So that means it's not that heavy as starting a whole virtual machine, but it's really fast because if Docker basis, like the Docker server is started, you already have a lot of the resources there, and then it's really easy to start a new container like a Tomcat or JBoss really fast. And the images are described by a source file, which can be versioned. And so it's possible to define a Docker image for the server and use that in the background to run the Achillean test on. So Achillean has an own extension for that. So in Achillean, there's this so-called Achillean cube. Okay, so I used cube here, and then I can run the whole stuff. Wait a second here, I have it. I can the whole stuff on Docker, and I just provide the image. So you create your Docker image, and this is now started in the background. And Docker works a bit like like Maven. If you don't have that Docker image on your local machine, it connects to Docker Hub, which is basically like Maven Central, and even downloads it there if you don't have it, and you can specify a version and this kind of thing. So it's really easy to have a defined environment for this test case. And if you're doing this, that actually it's really know-how which you can use later on as well in order to build production service. We see that actually more and more happening, not that much, but it gets more and more that the people are provisioning production servers on Docker. So you could have the naked server as one Docker image, and actually we provide a couple of Docker images ourselves. You can run like all the distributions on Tomcat or JBoss via Docker easily. And then you can have your own image, which basically adds your deployment on top of that. And then you have the same environment for the scope 2 test cases and for your production systems, which is actually really cool. Okay, maybe that was kind of a outlook. So that was the scope 2 we're doing tests on, and then you have the biggest scope, which is actually a bit out of scope for today, where you say you test the whole system end to end, where you need the external system, test systems there, you need a user interface, and doing really an end-to-end test. The important thing is that you have to make sure that you know what your goal is. So if you, for example, if you want to do performance or load testing, what I would make sure is that the installation is really close to your production environment, because you normally don't lose any time in the process engine. It's really fast. I mean, we had a webinar on performance, we have figures, we're really fast. So you don't lose the time here. You normally use the time when you, for example, calling services or calling external systems. You have network overhead or latencies and these kind of things, and that normally sums up to if you get performance issues, maybe normally out of the areas, and that's something you should check. So you should really build a system in a production-like environment and then steer that from the outside via, for example, REST API. If you want to do a functional test, you normally use the user interface to steer it, or the services. So that depends a bit on what you do. And there are actually a lot of tools you might want to use there. I cannot give a hint which is the best environment for that. But what we see often out there is JMeter or HP Load Runner in order to do load testing or performance testing, in order to really put stress on the machines. But we also saw a lot of scripting, like whatever, Perl scripts or Python scripts or whatever, in order to create load. But JMeter is really good at that. We see a lot of SOAP UI in order to do functional testing from the outside, steering SOAP or REST services. We see Selenium, for example, in order to front-end test, or we, for example, for our HTML5 front-ends, we use an own JavaScript stack in order to test them. A couple of frameworks, which are called Mocha, Chai, Grunt, Karma, and Protector. So if you're doing HTML5 tests, that might be interesting for you as well. And other things. Okay. On the external systems, it's always easy to, always important to have them in a defined state. So that's often hard in order to get a, for example, SAP system in the required state. It might help to to work with virtual machines or even Docker there in order to get them. Just delete them after the test and reset up them. Not always possible for all systems. So that's always the hardest part, actually, to get that working. Yeah. The more important thing about scope 3 is you should actually think about which tests you want to write. So that's the normal discussion. So which or how much test cases should we write, on which scope should they be, and these kind of things. So there's no basic, no general answer for that. You have to think about yourself. But what I can share from our experience is that basically the effort of writing on the tests on the different scopes is pretty different. So if you're writing tests on scope 1, that's actually pretty straightforward normally, but it's some effort. If you're doing manual tests, it's normally not a very big initial effort. You're thinking through the scenarios, but the effort of running the test is pretty high. Whereas on scope 1, it's just really running a unit test. That's no effort at all, or basically no effort. If you're using scope 2, it's a bit more effort to maintain. It depends on what you do exactly. It might be even a bit higher, and it's a bit more effort to run. You might need something in the background, like in my case, I had a JBoss running or Docker or whatever. So it's already a bit more effort, and especially more risk that if something is not working in that environment, the risk is pretty high that somebody is turning off the test because they are not running. Oh, we have an emergency here. We have to deliver something fast. We cannot fix them now. We just disable them. So this is a big risk on scope 2. That's why I'm a bigger fan of doing scope 1 tests really well and doing scope 2 tests for everything where I need scope 2. But yeah, not doing only scope 2. On the other hand, if you're doing scope 2 a lot, I wouldn't test the same stuff on scope 1 again, because then you have duplicate effort. Okay. If you want to do scope 3 in an automated, correct way, that's a lot of effort. Okay. We actually don't have a lot of customers. We have very few customers doing that. It depends on basically on the risk if you ship something with a failure. So for example, we have Zalando as a customer, which is e-commerce, a really big e-commerce site. So they have a web shop, that's their core business. So if you order something there, and if you have a problem in the checkout process, for example, that's really a big problem for them. So and they are going in that, and we want to get something live very quickly. So they invest in automated testing there, and we invest a lot in automated scope 3 testing to have all the user interfaces end-to-end tested. But we are a vendor, right? So for most of the projects, I think that doesn't make too much sense. It's just too much effort. What it can do instead is running a lot of scope 3 tests manually, but that means that's a lot of effort for the execution, right? So for every deployment, you have to click through a whole maybe documented test suite, but manually, which I don't see that often, actually. Normally it's a smoke test, like clicking a couple of things through. Might be okay for you, right? That's a decision you have to make when you know the risk of something failing. And there's an image which I liked actually in a current blog. So if you don't do any tests, you obviously have very high risk. If you do too much tests, you have really a lot of effort, a lot of cost. So you have to find the balance between them too. And that's not always easy, and it will include a lot of discussion. Normally it does, right? And there's no general answer. I just gave you a couple of basically from my experiences. Okay, so quick recap, and then I have a goodie for you, and then we go to the questions. So we have the scope 1, there's where most of the tests happen. It's in memory, it's single threaded, you saw the JUnit stuff, it's really straightforward. You might have scope 2 if you have JPA or other things which need an environment. Fine. then we do that on scope 2. How we do that depends on the environment. In Spring, we just do JUnit. In Java EE, Killian might be a good choice. And we have the scope 3 where we test everything end to end. Okay. If the scope doesn't make sense for you, it would be interesting for me to know, actually. Then come back to me by email or by forum, whatever. Then I'm always open to discuss that. But this is something that distills from our experiences over actually a lot of projects by now. So this is something we work with a lot at the moment. Yeah, as a quick outlook, I wanted to give you at least a quick insight of how we do testing the platform internally. I think that's not that important for your daily work because I guess you're not building a BPM platform. You're building process applications where it's much easier to test. But anyway, I thought it might be interesting. So the challenge we face is that we have a lot of components in the platform. We are maintaining a lot of versions, and they're getting more and more every day, basically. We're releasing 2 versions a year, so we get a lot of versions. We have the community and the enterprise edition. Then we have a lot of containers, like WebSphere, WebLogic, Tomcat, JBoss, Wildfly, and these kind of things, maybe even different versions of them. We have databases, again, different versions of the databases. We have different platforms like JDKs, not only Java 7 and 8, but also the IBM JDK or the Sun Hotspot or the old Oracle JRocket or whatever. So, and we have all the combinations, and we have support SLAs, which are 24/7, and we have big customers running really mission-critical stuff on the machine. So what we wanted to achieve is that we basically can have every combination possible pretty quickly. And we run, obviously, everything automated with every build. Okay, and that was actually a big challenge. And we reorganized the whole QA infrastructure basically end of last year and the beginning of this year. This is how it looked like now. Yeah, but we have a couple of really clever guys working on that. So I'm actually pretty proud of what we had there, even if I didn't build it. But it's pretty cool from the results. So we use Docker a lot. So we have basically a basis Docker image. Then we build an image for every database. So it might be Oracle 10G, for example. And for all the containers we support, like Tomcat or WebSphere, these kind of things, even again with the version and all that stuff, they can be linked together. So that we have the WebSphere linked to the Oracle database or WebSphere linked to DB2 and these kind of things. So we have all the combinations. Then we run a Jenkins, our CI server, which has a lot of jobs with all the combinations running. Then we leverage Docker infrastructure in order to basically start the right image from Jenkins when the job starts. And then we use Killian in order to run the test cases on the right server. We use something which is called Docker Swarm in the background, which basically allows us to add hardware easily. So we have more hardware, then we can run more Docker image in parallel, which basically means we can run more jobs in parallel. So that really scales horizontally now. So if we have new versions or new containers or new databases, we just have to set up the new image. And then we create new jobs, and maybe if it gets too slow, the whole build time, we add new hardware, and then we can easily scale up the whole QA infrastructure. The Jenkins jobs are created by something we call a seed job. So that's kind of a Jenkins DSL, which basically means all the jobs are committed into our GitHub sources as source code. So everything you see here is source code in GitHub. And we can basically throw away the whole QA infrastructure now and set it up in maybe minutes or hours, which is actually pretty sophisticated. Okay, yeah, this is how we do testing. Yeah, and this is how it looks like. Not that interesting at the moment, but you see all the different jobs on the different containers with the different database. So you can imagine that this list is rather long. And we do all the UI testing as well. Yeah, so that's something I already mentioned. So I think that's even something which makes us pretty unique again. So I cannot imagine that any other, at least open source vendor, but maybe other vendors have these sophisticated infrastructure at the moment. So that's it from me. I'm 5 minutes over time. I'm sorry for that. So we will have a bit less time for the questions. But I hope that's okay with you, and I hope that was somehow interesting for you to get an insight in our testing experiences. If you want to start with that right now, what I can do is, I mean, on camunda.org you can download the whole stuff. I provide the URL for the sources in the chat. If you if you have some questions later on, or you want to talk about how to use Camunda in your environment, or you have some other questions like whatever, pricing of the enterprise edition or these kind of things, ask us. If you have any questions for me later on, send me an email. Okay, and let me quickly go back to this one. Yeah, right. I want to run a quick poll actually in order to get a bit of feedback. Okay. And now we can get to the questions. Let me make that quick, actually, because we are already over time. So I answer the first question I find, actually. So there was the question if mocking can only be done for the expressions as I showed them, or it can be done for a class as well. So if you provide the class, within your Eclipse, with the service task, if you provide a class, what we do is we do a new instance of that Java delegate. That means depending on the mock framework and the configuration, that might be that you can inspect that new instance from the mock framework, and it works easily. Otherwise, we create the instance, and then it might be a bit more tricky in order to inject the mock within the delegate, but that it depends on a couple of factors, so it's actually hard to give a general answer. But if you're struggling with that, I recommend to ask the concrete question with maybe a code example in the forum, and then I'm pretty sure you will get an answer. Okay, guys, I'm sorry for the delay. I hope that was interesting for you. Thank you for watching. Have fun with Camunda BPM, and maybe see you next time in the next webinar. Thank you and bye.